I wanted to make a few comments about the unfortunate passing of Brian Wilson last week. As most of you know, Brian is my single biggest musical influence. I have spent a number of years obsessing over his chord progressions and production style, and with more or less success, applied some of the knowledge from his songs to my own compositions and productions. I've made music that is an homage to Brian with a project called ISS, and I've also used some of the techniques and chord progressions I've learned from him in my side projects High Castle Teleorchestra and Stratosphere. So what my channel is about here, Tim Smolens Music, what differentiates me from some of the other music channels is I analyze really great songs and do a deep dive on their chord progressions and songwriting devices. And what's brought in the most number of views on this channel has been the Beach Boys, primarily a video I made on God Only Knows and the chord progression there that kind of took off and went viral, and not really, but viral in that world where it got 50 or 100,000 views or something like that, as opposed to most of my other videos which had like 240 views. The death of Brian Wilson is really sad. He did live a pretty full life. I mean, he made it to I don't even know how old he was. I didn't look it up. 80 something. He accomplished so much. He also suffered a lot. He was gracious enough to finally finish the Smile album in 2004, which is a huge redemption story, which I'll get into a little bit later. Almost puts him in this mythological category with what he really accomplished in his life, honestly. Anyway, on my page, check out the playlist page, and you can see a whole bunch of Beach Boys songs with really deep chord progression and songwriting analysis that I think you'll enjoy if you like these geeky videos. In my opinion, Brian Wilson is the greatest pop or rock composer of all time, and there will likely never be another that reaches similar heights. He is sort of, like I said, a mythological or even a religious type of figure in pop music, in the same way that the Beatles, are collectively like that mythological figure. But the Beatles and Brian Wilson is a strange comparison because they were competitors, and a lot of Beatles are more popular. There's no question who won that one. The Beach Boys are kind of more sophisticated. I don't know if that means that they're better, but in the Beatles, it takes multiple brilliant songwriters, Lennon, McCartney, even Harrison, whereas Brian did everything in the Beach Boys. He wrote pretty much everything. Then they had their own producer, George Martin, and Brian did the production also. So that, it took a whole bunch of Beatles to equal one Brian Wilson. I personally like the Beach Boys better, but the Beatles are obviously one of the most amazing bands ever as well. But it's a close comparison, and they really were competing. People have compared Brian Wilson to like a classical composer, and I don't think that's really true, other than that I think people are hearing a sophistication in his music that's not present in most of the 1-4-5 pop music that we hear, in most of pop history. He does different bass notes or chord inversions. He does counterpoint on like background vocals and orchestral timbres with lots of different instruments. So that's why he sounds, people compare him to classical music. There's not really much classical music that Brian Wilson sounds like, but like I said, more sophistication. In my opinion, 1967's unfinished Smile album is the absolute pinnacle of Brian Wilson's powers, and even of the pop rock genre itself. Smile, even in its unfinished form, gave us this roadmap for how we could elevate rock into something more cinematic, more psychedelic, more sophisticated, with a narrative, with interesting instruments. Pet Sounds would have to be my second favorite Beach Boys release, and everyone knows that makes everyone's top 5 list. But there are so many highlights along the way from the previous years of the Beach Boys. The Warmth of the Sun, The Girls on the Beach, Please Let Me Wonder, She Knows Me Too Well, Surfer Girl, In My Room, Kiss Me Baby. There's so many amazing songs. It's unbelievable. It's hard to look at the story of Brian Wilson and not see a likeness to the Icarus myth of flying too high to the sun. I mean, the man was 24 years old at the peak of his career. My controversial take on the whole Brian Wilson story is that after Smile was abandoned in '67 and he retreated to more drugs and mental illness set in even further, eventually the charlatan psychiatrist, he was a broken man. And in some ways, he never really returned, except that he came back and against all odds finished Smile and gave us this amazing arrangement of an album that was like 90% done and unreleased in 1967. So it's this lost, if you don't know what Smile is, go look it up. It's a lost treasure of rock music. But as an old man, he came back and finished it. So that is, I think, the greatest gift he could have given to us. But It's not that I don't like post-Smile Brian Wilson. I just think he never returned to the height of his powers. I know if a lot of fans get upset if I say, I just don't like the 70s stuff as much. I know there's some good songs in there, but Brian never returned to the helm of the studio. In fact, they brought the studio to his house so that when he could wanted to wander out of his bedroom and finally record, it was right there. But it wasn't the same studios with the same studio musicians and all of that stuff. But Brian has a mixed bag of a story, a lot of triumph and a lot of sadness, but I don't think there's anything after Smile that even hints at the heights that Brian pointed to with Pet Sounds and Smile. And to think that he was 24 years old when that was happening is absolutely mind-blowing, and that he spent most of the rest of his life on some sort of downward slide from that top of the world where he was temporarily, with all those resources, and he had money and he could bring in whatever studio musicians he wanted, to at some point just being on some sort of drugs and not wanting to get out of bed. So it's not that I don't acknowledge there's some great Beach Boys songs in the 70s. I just see this alternate universe where Smile had come out and the sophistication of it had the chance to affect pop music and make people see that there was a lot more that a record could be, or that a recording could be, or the creativity that you could have with background vocals. With Smile, it's off the charts. Doing, doing, doing. I can't deny that I lament the lost history, that if that Brian that was flying so high at 24 and making Smile had been allowed to flourish, or it had come out and then it had hit all the people were turning on and doing all the the psychedelics and listening to other bands that were coming out at the time, Smile would have blown people's minds. So there is an alternate history that I am very fond of, where Smile did come out and it affected rock and didn't make it so Beavis and Butthead like it is now, because rock and pop is really pretty much a joke at this point. I do shed some tears for that lost history, because that is a branch that I would love to explore. Maybe we could make a Netflix show about it, yeah. So what do I love about Brian Wilson's music? What do I want to point out that's unique? Obviously, what comes to mind first is the chord progressions. Warmth of the Sun. The Girls on the Beach, Keep an Eye on Summer, Surf's Up. Wonderful. These are some of the greatest chord progressions of all time. They have this pop sophistication. They're maybe a little jazzy without being like snotty jazzy. I don't know how to explain it. They're more pop than they are jazz, but wild key changes, wild bass notes. That is one thing he does have in common with classical composers, is using non-roots in the bass, where if a C, you might use a G in the bass instead of C, or an E in the bass, or a B flat. Obviously, what else comes to mind? The vocal harmonies for the Beach Boys. They were more likened to like a 4 or 5 part barbershop or doo-wop harmony, sometimes with counterpoint, than the typical thirds that most pop groups, including the Beatles, were using mostly. Most people could not pull off the complexity of the Beach Boys vocals, but they don't really sound complex. They just sound nice and angelic. But, they were brothers. They had been singing since they were little. There was a certain spiritual closeness of that group that cannot be denied with their vocal sound. And then as you start approaching Pet Sounds and Smile, the syllables and counterpoint that Brian was using were something we've never heard before out of background vocals. So really, there's never been a better group vocal than the Beach Boys. But yeah, like I said, a lot of their influences are more barbershop and doo-wop and the Four Freshmen and things like that really had these vocal groups that could do jazzy harmonies. Another thing that it really comes to mind with Brian is as a producer and an orchestrator. Obviously, he took some huge cues from Phil Spector and that sort of recording of the 60s and 50s, with all those big orchestras and bands in a studio recording live most of the time. So Brian took Phil Spector's wall of sound with all the instruments, and then during Pet Sounds, he kind of personalized it and be like, maybe we just need an oboe and a bass harmonica or whatever instruments. He was using these very specific palettes of instruments that painted a picture. And then with Smile, he was able to turn it pictorial, where he's like, this is about the Old West, so this actually sounds like a cowboy like bouncing on a little horse, go riding on the farm or whatever, or it's a railroad train, roaring down the track. it sounds like a railroad train. So Smile, he took that idea that you could use particular instruments to a degree that has never been even remotely approached in pop or rock music, and achieved something there that I don't think could probably be matched. I mean, just to give you an example of the instruments, Cabin Essence off Smile, they had a plucked upright piano, an upright bass that I think sometimes bowed, sometimes pizzicato. They have banjo, a fuzz bass, two cellos, a dobro, slide guitar, a harmonica, accordion, bass harmonica, flute. But there's like no drums or anything. There's even a bouzouki, a tambourine, a metal clank for the railroad, hitting the nail into the railroad sound. And then there's the strange background vocals. So it's a very, very particular palette for music. Listen to Cabin Essence, you'll hear all those instruments, but it's unbelievable. And Brian really brought it to a sense of perfection on Pet Sounds and then Smile. Another amazing thing is Brian allowed the song topics to really expand. Obviously, the Beach Boys wrote about cars and surfing when they were young, and then a lot about girls. And Pet Sounds was even kind of like a lament of lost innocence, and not super complex lyrics. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, or God only knows, but definitely elevated from the car and surf stuff. But Smile, it turned into more of this like abstract poetry about Gothic American history, and the instruments would mirror the song themes with the most godlike creative background vocal usage you've ever heard. Brian called it his teenage symphony to God. Another quality of Brian Wilson that comes to mind as unique is his innocence. I mean, his voice sounds so angelic. The themes of his songs, he even has lots of songs that lament lost innocence, like Wonderful, or You Still Believe in Me, or Caroline No, or even just listening to In My Room or Surfer Girl. I mean, think about John Lennon by contrast, who's this snarky little figure, but Brian just is so much more innocent than almost everybody, and his voice sounds it. He has this really angelic quality to his voice. One thing I liked about Brian is his willingness to mention God, even though it had become uncool even in his day in the 60s. But the song God Only Knows and Wonderful, they did an arrangement of the Lord's Prayer that had this barbershop type of treatment. Yeah, whatever the truth really is, Brian now knows it. The afterlife is kind of slanted toward the believer in a certain way. It really is, because if there's nothing anyway when you die, it kind of didn't matter. But like, if there is something, you're maybe already like believing in that direction. I don't know. So like, it's just slanted. Like, an atheist might be totally right, but it's not. There are certain advantages, I think, that humans have had all throughout their history, where everyone has certain beliefs. So I'm only saying all of this because Brian's willingness to say God and not really mind and make it beautiful, I find awesome. So cool. So let me share some memories. I am also a Southern California boy like Brian. I grew up probably with less than 20 miles away from Hawthorne, so I know about the sun and the sand and the California weather thing. As I was growing up, I played more like rock guitar and the 80s glam metal at the time, so all you'd hear from Beach Boys was the K-Earth 101 playing Fun, 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 and you just the square surf and car band that most people think of them as. They weren't playing God Only Knows, or sometimes Wouldn't It Be Nice Maybe, or Good Vibrations, but I wouldn't even notice how psychedelic Good Vibration was. I'd hear, if you hear Fun, 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 and then Good Vibrations, you don't notice the theremin and the cello, and it's like this really psychedelic arrangement. When I was older, after high school, I was working at this pizza shop at the bus station in Santa Cruz, and I used to always change it to the oldies station. Everyone else wanted like the modern rock, but I always go to the oldies station. And sometimes Surfer Girl would come on, and I was making the pizzas, and I would just stop and listen to those, like, wow, those harmonies. I think I was watching some Bee Gees documentary, and they said the same thing. They were in Australia, and they heard the Beach Boys on the radio on the beach, and they all just stopped and went, those harmonies. But, yeah. Then in high school, we started getting into more weird music like Mr. Bungle, and started to realize that the Beach Boys had this hip, psychedelic, wild arrangements and exotic orchestrations that a lot of the public didn't even notice. Like I said, on Good Vibrations, it's such a psychedelic song, but people would just hear, I'm picking up a good vibe. Finally, I was late to the game, but people showed me, you got to listen to Pet Sounds, and then I got into the whole Smile tape trading scene and realized that they had this lost masterpiece that Brian Wilson had abandoned and lost his mind right when it was about to be done, and it turned into this total like rock and roll Icarus tragedy. I used to go on tour with my band Stratosphere, and I would assemble my version of Smile. Everyone would put together their favorite arrangement, and I'd wrap it in this photocopy, double-sided, of like information about Smile and lyrics and all this stuff. And people to this day are like, I remember outside of Michigan, some city in Michigan, Ann Arbor, and you gave me the Smile CD in the parking lot, and that had this effect on me. But like, I was a proselytizer of Smile. I'm sorry, I really thought it was like the Jesus of rock music. I'm not even saying that flippantly, honestly. Brian Wilson has a certain spiritual quality to his music that I think is hard to ignore. That's just my opinion. That's what I like about him. So besides all the wild and psychedelic arrangements of Pet Sounds and Smile, I also have an especial affinity for the tender ballads, all the Surfer Girls and the In My Room, Warmth of the Sun. There's so many of them. Keep an Eye on Summer, just that innocent Beach Boys ballad with those rich, stacked vocal harmonies that are different than any other groups. I did get to meet Brian once backstage, and I can't remember if it was one of his concerts at the Hollywood Bowl, or was it like a Paul Simon concert. Sometime in the early 2000s, my dad had access to like lots of backstage because he was this doctor in LA that knew all of these people. Anyway, he was always going to shows, but I met him and literally floundered and was like, I'm a big fan, and like I literally have been like obsessing over his music for years. I wish I had it on video. My dad's like, yeah, you completely blew that one. So I don't know what I said, but it wasn't much. I just think I said I'm a big fan and shook his hand, but I could have taken it somewhere else. But anyway, all that to say, he's become my biggest musical influence, and studying his music is the passion of this channel. I hope you enjoy that and can participate in that, and I hope to see more of you. God bless Brian and his family, and God only knows what pop music would have been like without Brian. Please make sure to check out my Beach Boys playlists on this channel. I've got probably dozens at this point of their songs, and lots of other amazing songs that are worthwhile to learn if you want to be a better songwriter. I have a Patreon, High Castle Conservatory, and check out my Brian Wilson inspired music, ISS, on Bandcamp. Thank you.